25 seconds.
Oh no, don't worry. I was going to open the window, but I won't. Oh, it's so exciting.
Live. Hey, I'm Fran, and I'll be your presenter tonight for tonight's live chat. Our live chat series is kicking off with two members of the legal team at Friends of the Earth. Will Rundle, who leads the team and is a solicitor. Say hello, Will.
Hello.
And lawyer Katie DeCawe.
Hi.
So Will and Katie are going to be talking a bit about the campaign to stop a third runway at Heathrow and how Friends of the Earth came to get involved with the local groups. They'll talk for about 20 minutes and then we'll open it up for some questions. I'll be sharing links and ways you can get involved with our campaign at the end of the live chat. Before we start, just got a couple of bits of housekeeping to share. For the answer portion of the live chat, we've received over 100 questions so far from supporters, so we'll be answering a mix of those as well as fielding questions from the live audience. And in terms of privacy and security, we've done everything to ensure that this live chat runs smoothly, but if anything untoward does happen, we do have moderators on hand to shut things down, so bear with us in the unlikely event that this happens. But that's all from me for now, so I'll pass over to Will and Katie to tell you a bit more about Heathrow. We've received over 100 questions so far from supporters.
Hi everyone. First of all, just to extend a massive thank you for you joining us on this webinar this evening. It's great to have so many of you here tonight. And we're going to be focusing on how Friends of the Earth has got to the point of winning this incredible case at the Court of Appeal and what's coming next. So I'm going to do a bit of a scene setting to give a bit of a backdrop to this court case, and then my colleague Will's going to go on to talk about the nuts and bolts of the case itself, and then we'll go on to explore some of the wider implications. So I'm aware that there may be some people on the call who are a little less familiar with Friends of the Earth as an organisation. So just by way of background, we are the largest grassroots campaigning organisation in the world. We've actually got over 70 sister organisations in countries across the globe, from the global north as well as the global south, and our focus is very much on campaigning and empowering communities so that they can achieve environmental protection objectives in a socially just and progressive way. So that's our focus. Friends of the Earth, the Friends of the Earth England, Wales and Northern Ireland is the branch that has brought this Heathrow litigation, and we've got 4 key campaigns at the moment, which includes our climate campaign, and it's within that the Heathrow litigation has sat. As a legal team, we're very much cross-cutting and we work with different campaigns at any one time, but our goal is always to seek to use the law to further environmental protection objectives and the goals of the organisation as a whole. So a bit of scene setting in terms of Heathrow, the Heathrow case itself. So Friends of the Earth brought these proceedings, or started these proceedings, back in the summer of 2018. But actually Friends of the Earth's involvement in resisting Heathrow expansions considerably predated that. I want to mention in particular the communities involved in resisting Heathrow expansion and our incredible Friends of the Earth West London local group network, who have been tirelessly campaigning against Heathrow expansion for decades now. And they've been doing this on a variety of grounds, including, for example, concerns over the environment, health and well-being. And there's a really harsh practical reality to local communities of Heathrow expansion going ahead. So around 4,000 homes would be lost if that expansion happens. So you can see how devastating that would be for local people. In terms of our case has been focused on climate change and the climate emergency. But prior to this case, Friends of the Earth was also involved in terms of the legal team in assisting communities to resist Heathrow expansion, because we stood up for the right to protest and challenge the draconian injunction that the operator of Heathrow sought to obtain, which would have all but stifled freedom of expression and the right to protest. And we ensured that that was not back in 2007, thereby protecting a civil society space to continue its opposition to Heathrow expansion. So our case that we're focusing on now, as I said, began in 2018, and it followed and was a challenge to the government's decision to adopt the Airport National Policy Statement without proper consideration of its climate change obligations. Now, the Airport National Policy Statement is the government's in-principle support for Heathrow expansion. And our case, as I said, was based on the climate obligations of the government, and Plan B Earth also raised a climate challenge. There were other parties that were also involved in the litigation, for example, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, the local authorities and Greenpeace, but their arguments were advanced on other in other areas. So as I said, our case was focused on climate, but it's important, I think, to see this in the context, in the broader context of both the local issues and the global issues. So I've already mentioned the local issues and the work of our community groups in resisting Heathrow expansion. There's also a global context to this because our Heathrow challenge is an example of litigation across the world, which is seeing citizens and concerned individuals take governments and take big business to court over their failure to properly address the climate emergency. And that's what this Heathrow litigation is fundamentally all about, because Heathrow on its own, as it already is one of the single largest sources of greenhouse emissions in the country, and therefore, in our view, expansion is just completely the wrong decision to be making and would all but jeopardize our ability to meet our own carbon reduction targets. So our case went before the High Court back in March 2019 and then went on to the Court of Appeal in October 2019. And in terms of the procedure we were using, we were challenging a decision by the government by way of judicial review. This is a process which allows citizens to take account, to bring government to account where they commit legal errors or there's a failure of due process. For example, they don't consider an important factor in a decision-making process, but it is not about challenging the merits of a decision. So I'm now going to hand over to Will, who's going to talk more specifically about our legal case.
Thanks very much, Katie, for that excellent intro. So as you say, I'm going to run through now a summary of our legal case and the campaign context for it. And as some of you here today might know, Friends of the Earth has an ambitious organisational goal for ensuring that the next generation, it enjoys an environment that's getting better. Achieving a safer climate is obviously part of that. We also want to secure environmental justice for people and planet, or climate justice as it is in this case, which means fair and inclusive answers to the climate crisis we are all suffering. Our climate campaigning and stopping Heathrow expansion, they're based on these principles. Our intervention here was, as you've been hearing, to lend support to the long-term effort of the community groups to resist a highly damaging development for them on the ground, to strengthen all those voices at a critical time when a legal challenge to the Airport National Policy Statement was possible. But we also wanted to stop a development that in and of itself would likely mean we don't hit our national carbon reduction targets under our Climate Change Act, which of course would worsen the climate breakdown. So Heathrow is one of the single biggest sources of carbon emissions in the UK. It would have got even bigger if we had not stopped it. This would clearly have added to the global cumulative problem we face, but the proposal would also have led to around 700 extra flights per day, and already local people endure approximately 1,300 noisy planes landing and taking off at Heathrow daily. So all of this would have created some very real environmental impacts, and for some people those are impacts for people who do not even fly, including in climate vulnerable countries abroad. So it's worth bearing that in mind. Heathrow expansion represents, to us at least, and to many other people, an environmental justice problem, not only because of the carbon emissions, but also because of the inequality in the way flights are taken. Just around 15% of the UK's population take the majority, around 70% of all flights. This minority of frequent flyers, they are taking the most damaging flights, and a bigger airport would have worsened this picture. It's important to bear in mind here, though, that we're not saying no one should take any flights at all. Going on holiday, that's okay. But that there is an inequality in the distribution of flying that creates a social justice issue here, given the environmental consequences of flying that are created. Although overall, we are saying we do need to fly less. When we talk about sustainable development, which is a core ground of our case, fairness is a really important part of that. One can see there are strong intergenerational fairness aspects to this legal concept, as I'll get onto, and indeed within how the climate crisis is currently playing out. Sustainable development, properly understood, is about satisfying our own needs without compromising the needs of future generations to come. So this litigation obviously has some specific legal grounds and objectives and potential outcomes, but they sit within this wider justice-based campaigning context of action on climate change and on climate justice. So that's really the context or rationale, if you like, for our case. I'm going to now give a brief overview of the appeal. And I think the High Court result was really quite a tough one for us to take, if I'm honest. It went strongly against us. And let's face it, the stakes are high in this case. But we came out swinging on it and determined not to let this damaging development go ahead, given the national climate emergency we are all in. We won the right to appeal early on in 2019 on the basis that there was a real prospect of success on our grounds, alleging a breach of the government's sustainable development duties and a failure to undertake what's called a strategic environmental assessment in line with the relevant EU directive. It was a really tough period for us, as we had to turn around effectively a winning case in very short order, as well as dig deep for the extra funds to take it. All this in just a couple of weeks. In essence, we were arguing that the government had failed to fully consider the climate impacts of the development and how that fitted with the Paris Agreement on climate change. That is, when discharging its duty to contribute to sustainable development as it needed to. In essence, our case segmented into four main areas: a failure to consider the Paris Agreement, a failure to consider what are called non-CO2 warming impacts of aviation, which can be up to a doubling of the overall impact. So that's non-carbon emissions warming impact. A failure to consider the carbon emissions themselves beyond 2050, despite assessing its economic benefits of the whole airport operation for its full length. And a failure to consider the Paris Agreement again, but this is specifically as part of the strategic environmental assessment I mentioned, so it's a slightly different legal regime for that one. So we'd already won some important points at the High Court, that the government had admitted that it had ignored the Paris Agreement, non-CO2 warming impacts, and the effect of emissions beyond 2050. It had intentionally ignored them. The question now was focused on very much, was that lawful for them to do that? Were they allowed to just completely discount them or not? An important part of answering that question, though, was based on what the law required in discharging that duty to contribute to sustainable development. And as mentioned earlier, at a high policy level, which is what we have with the airport's national policy statement, the Secretary of State needed to consider the needs of future generations, not just ours right now, when taking a balanced approach to considering the environmental, the social and the economic elements that make up sustainable development. That is, when deciding to make this airport national policy statement. It's within this framework he has to take particular regard to the desirability of mitigating climate change with respect to aviation expansion in this case. So going back to the four main arguments that I mentioned before, we used this framing to demonstrate illegality. So for example, on intentionally ignoring the Paris Agreement. This is the main international instrument for dealing with climate change now and in the future. It is more ambitious and more encompassing in some respects than the Climate Change Act that we have in the UK, which at the time that the AMPS was made back in 2018 was focused on a target equivalent of around 2 degrees warming by 2050, not the net zero we have now. The Paris Agreement is more than just a temperature target though, but failing to consider it and its greater ambition for action on climate change, we argued, is a failure to consider the needs of future generations with regards to mitigating climate change. It's about improving that picture for those future generations. On the failure to provide a tool for the increased warming impacts from non-CO2 warming effects of aviation, it is accepted that the non-CO2 warming impacts of aviation are uncertain. but it is clear that they are considerable and possibly equivalent in magnitude to those from carbon emissions. We argued that an approach which intentionally ignored them rather than taking a precautionary approach up front meant that we could not avoid those impacts, and the brunt of that would have to be borne unexpectedly later on. This could mean much harsher adjustments for future generations, ones that we could actually be avoiding now. And on the failure to consider climate change impacts of the development beyond the 2050 target date in the Climate Change Act, given that the airport would have been operated till 2085, and indeed that they had assessed those economic benefits of the development for its full length of operation, we considered this was a really clear example of failing to consider, those needs of future generations as part of a balanced approach to sustainable development. They were clearly, preferring and prioritising economy over environment, and these emissions, they were real. They would be biting hard at some future point. So those are the arguments that we ran on sustainable development. We also ran another argument, as I mentioned earlier, on the Paris Agreement being taken into account or not in the strategic environmental assessment process too. So I'll pass back now to Katie to say how it went.
Katie, you're on mute, I think. So just if you unmute there.
Sorry, everyone. Well, the actual date of the hand down was absolutely incredible outside court. It was, full of, the streets were packed despite the fact that it had been pouring with rain, and everybody was cheering, and it was just such a feeling of celebration and absolutely unbelievable to have been there. In terms of what this judgment means then and the wider implications of it, well, first of all, this is a huge victory for climate justice, and it's really important to state that loud and clear, because this was not an easy battle for us to win. And we went, as Will said, we went from the High Court, where we lost on every single ground and were told that our case was inarguable, to winning on every single ground in the Court of Appeal. So it was a real turnaround and absolutely incredible after that first reception in the High Court. And this case has been described as one of the most important environmental cases in a generation in this country. And we think the really exciting thing about it is, first of all, it has stopped Heathrow expansion in its tracks. And secondly, there are potentially implications for other decision-making processes as well. So first of all, the Court of Appeal found unanimously that the AMPS had been adopted unlawfully. And they ruled that the AMPS would cease to have any legal effect whatsoever unless and until the government conducted a review to correct the numerous legal errors which they'd identified. So at the moment, the AMPS is basically a zombie policy. This case threw up a lot of other issues as well. For example, it really underscored the importance of the role of the court in the judiciary, because there have been a number of comments recently by certain sections of the media and by politicians that our courts are somehow wading into political debates where they have no business being. And this judgment is very clear that that is not what the Court of Appeal has done. What they have done is to uphold the will of Parliament. They've upheld parliamentary sovereignty by finding that the government has not complied with its duties under the Planning Act, which was enacted by Parliament. It's also really underscored for me the importance of campaigning as alongside judicial review proceedings, both in terms of the sustained resistance by the local community groups I mentioned earlier, and also just looking back at Friends of the Earth's work in years gone by. So we've helped to win a massively important case for climate justice off the back of a duty which Friends of the Earth itself campaigned for, the Section 10 Sustainable Development Duty, when the Planning Act was actually enacted. This judgment also opens up the possibility of decisions involving other big carbon projects and plans being challenged on climate grounds like the Paris Agreement as well, and that's incredibly exciting too. And we can see some of these things, these sorts of cases beginning to emerge now. So for example, the Transport Action Network is looking to bring a judicial review challenge against the government in relation to their Road Investment Strategy 2, which was adopted without consideration of the Paris Agreement. This is a massive road building scheme for the country, so it's got big carbon implications. And we've been providing them with some support and working with them on that. We're also aware that the Good Law project is looking to bring a challenge in relation to the energy MPS. They've called for a review of this MPS again on the basis that it has it needs to be updated given that the Paris Agreement was ratified in 2015 and it takes no account of that. So lots of really exciting things happening, and it'd be great to watch this space to see how they all develop. So I'll hand back to Will now to fill us in on the Supreme Court appeal.
Thanks, Katie. So we've made all that progress, and it's a great result for the environment and climate justice. But unfortunately, permission to appeal has very recently been granted by the Supreme Court for the airport and the developer to challenge this result. It's obviously disappointing to think that despite the government dropping out, these big corporate interests are still happy to argue, in effect, that we shouldn't think about things like Paris Agreement or those other points I was making earlier when expanding Heathrow in the midst of a climate emergency. Let's just ignore those and crack on. So that's disappointing. We will obviously, fight very hard to maintain where we've got to, and we and another organisation called Plan B are left to fight for the climate in this case. Other claimants that were in at the Court of Appeal stage, including Greenpeace, the London boroughs and the London Mayor, their case has unfortunately now been dismissed. So it's us, Heathrow Airport and the developer. Essentially, it's going to be a rerun of the climate case at the top of the court system, and no doubt the Supreme Court will have something very important to say about it. They are, after all, the Supreme Court. And so now it's really a case of ploughing on and watching and waiting and putting our best foot forward. However, we do go forwards with a strong Court of Appeal judgment from a very senior panel of judges in our favour. So that's a really good starting point. And we'll work very hard to maintain this result, which we believe is so important to achieve a safer climate for all of our benefit. So wish us luck. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks so much, Will and Katie, for that. I think often people get to know these cases through a media perspective, so knowing what happens behind the scenes and all of the work that goes on with local communities and yourselves is a really useful contribution to the conversation. Now we're going to turn to the question part of this live talk. As I mentioned earlier, we've got some pre-submitted questions and some from the live chat. So we'll try and get through as many as possible. I can see here from the moderator, the first question is from Colin in the live chat, and he asked, how important was local community involvement in something like the Heathrow case, as it had a more national or global element?
Shall I start with answering that one? And Katie, do chip in if you have extra points. I mean, from my perspective, it had lots of different impacts, and certainly from an initial impact, we were very inspired and wanted to support the efforts that we'd been seeing going on the ground. And in cases like these, I do think quite strongly that the context to the courtroom, the wider context in society and in the political arena and with protesters is really, really important. And one of the things that we've seen is from the start of the case to the end, a growing concern in society and indeed with these local community groups taking the lead in protesting, for example, outside court or pushing really hard in so many different ways. We saw that, I think, having a beneficial impact overall and has been really helpful.
Great, thank you. So now for one that was submitted before the live chat. In fact, we've heard a lot on this particular issue around the implication of the case on airport expansion at other airports. So will the case have ramifications for the expansion of airports like Manchester and Leeds Bradford? Well,
I should hope so, and I think it probably will. There are different, obviously it'll turn on the facts of the specific case, and where we're talking about things like a national policy statement under the Planning Act. So like this airport national policy statement, obviously this case has a very direct legal precedent setting value and will have a direct influence. So if this ever gets reviewed or they make a new one. With more local planning projects like Manchester Airport expansion, things like that, excuse me, I think this can influence those decisions as it opens the door for more powerful representations about climate change, where those projects also have a high carbon or climate impact. So where there are stronger parallels that you can bring or draw between the proposal in question and the Heathrow case, so high carbon, aviation, non-CO2 emissions impacts, then the stronger arguments can be made, and the judgment is likely to be quite persuasive and certainly a material consideration for a planning committee. And they'll have to take into account things like the Paris Agreement, which they might not otherwise do so.
Great, thank you. I think we've got another one from the live chat. Vicky has asked, what implications are there for other legal challenges on climate grounds, like the Wheeled Action Group's challenge on the Horse Hill oil permission?
Should I have a go at that one?
Sure.
Okay. Well, I think really it's quite similar to what Will said in relation to the airport expansion decisions. So I think the key thing really is how big of a carbon impact is something going to have, and there's also the question mark over well, in terms of Heathrow emissions, the emissions were very much direct emissions from that site. I suppose a counter argument against the direct relevance of the Heathrow judgment to developments which aren't creating direct emissions themselves would be that these are indirect, for example. But I think that the really crucial thing is the scale of the project's carbon implications, and also how similar are any legal requirements and duties on the government or on the decision maker as compared to the duties that were considered in the Heathrow judgment.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. Now this has been covered in the media a little bit, but will the coronavirus pandemic have any effect on Heathrow expansion? And that's from Joanna.
Right, I'll have a go at that one as well. Okay. Well, I mean, we're in the midst of this pandemic, and it's really hard to predict how it's going to affect things in the long term. I mean, certainly, I think it's recognised that businesses have got much more used to the idea of remote meetings as opposed to flying people here, there, and everywhere all the time. But how much that will stick remains to be seen. I think it's really important that we don't get complacent about the idea that the pandemic is going to have this long-term effect, which will definitely kill off Heathrow expansion, because we know the whole time that we are essentially facing off against an incredibly powerful industry, the aviation industry, who, for example, are very busy lobbying the government for unconditional bailouts, taxpayers' money for this. So I think we've got to be really alert to this, and whilst encourage businesses that they've done this during the pandemic, they can continue doing it, but we mustn't rest on our laurels, and we must ensure that a transition, the sort of new normal that we come to after the pandemic, has climate objectives and climate concerns at its heart, and that means carrying on with the fight against Heathrow expansion.
This is one that was submitted before the live chat. What 3 lessons do you take from this campaign's success that you think are applicable to other environmental campaigns?
Do you want to go for that one, Will, as I've answered too? Or?
Yeah, sure. I'm not sure what the order of play is. What 3 lessons? Well, as I was mentioning earlier, I think the importance of the campaigning context and the clamour in society and the change of political attitude is actually quite important, and that's certainly something I've been reflecting on. I think the need for having the courage of your convictions and the determination to push through is really important. Taking forward cases like this is not easy at the best of times, and indeed there's quite a low success rate overall in these types of claims, and you really need to stick with it and to make sure you get good advice and you think really hard about it. But the High Court result for us was a knockback, that's for sure, and we pushed through. What would be my third lesson? I'm not sure, Katie, do you have a third lesson you can add there?
Yeah, I think we could look to the experience of building a case following a campaign by local communities, and just in terms of both as an inspiration, but also in terms of that demonstrating the level of public interest that there was in this fight. And that was so, as really linking back to what you were saying about, cases not being taken in a vacuum, decisions not being taken in a vacuum, but that campaign work by people on the ground is such a powerful means of demonstrating that this is a case of huge public significance, which, ultimately will have an effect in the courtroom as well.
Okay, we've got one from the live chat from Ian, who asks, what is the status of the ecocide law and does this help?
So that's not, I don't believe that's currently law in the UK at the very least, and so I think that's Polly Higgins, isn't it, that produced that interesting and enforceable book. Yeah, so it's not currently law, can't be relied on, unfortunately. Would probably be a good idea.
I have to say I don't know anything about that law, so when I read that question I was like, oh Ian, tell me more. I'm just going to go to one of the pre-submitted questions now, bear with me. Could this case have implications for other projects such as HS2 or road building schemes?
So for similar reasons that I gave earlier in relation to the Manchester Airport, I think the short answer is yes, it can. That's assuming the Supreme Court doesn't overturn it, of course. And I think, for the determination of large-scale planning applications with, big potential impacts on the UK's ability to fight climate change, there'll be arguments now around taking the Paris Agreement into account, and also if it's been taken into account and discounted, what are the reasons for doing so? Are those reasons properly put out, explained, and that can present rather valid arguments that a decision is unlawful. The specifics obviously need to be worked out in relation to each project.
We've got one from Mark in the live chat. When assessing the carbon impacts of Heathrow and similar developments, are the additional carbon impacts of, for example, journeys to and from the airport taken into account?
I think the answer to that is yes, Mark, but from our perspective, not from our perspective, the reality is that the majority of the emissions are coming from aeroplanes actually in the air. So that's where our focus has been in terms of challenging this.
I'd agree with that. I think, if you're looking at the carbon impact of a proposal, then you need to look at all of the carbon impacts. Although I suppose the one interesting area would be around things like open cast coal mines, where you're talking about digging up a fossil fuel, but it's not, its end use is maybe the major part of the problem, and there are interesting arguments around things like that. So it can be quite a complex issue, but essentially you're looking at, certainly with the airport, the traffic wasn't taken into account.
Okay, and I think we've got one final question from someone in the live chat. Nick's asked, did your argument change in the Court of Appeal? And if not, why?
We argued it in a slightly different way because it's a slightly different stage of proceedings, but it's essentially the same case argued through. The way things work is that you put your case forward in the High Court, it gets dismissed in this instance, and then you're arguing against the reasoning of the judge. And in essence, but it's basically the same case, but you need to respond to the judgment that you've got and any other sort of procedural niceties. I mean, in our case, we not only got dismissed, but because it was what's called a rolled up hearing for those who are interested in civil procedure, we didn't get what's called a permission and that's usually a filter stage at the beginning of judicial review proceedings, where the judge validates early on whether your case is arguable or not. In our case, they decided not to do that, and they put it all together. So we had one big hearing, and so when we went to the Court of Appeal, we had to deal with that issue as well, and it was all bound up in rather technical ways. But yes, the case is the same, the points were the same, essentially.
I could just add to that very slightly. So in the Court of Appeal, as Will has elaborated already, we argued on the basis of Section 10 Sustainable Development Duty and the Environmental Assessment ground. In the Divisional Court, we'd also raised a further ground of challenge, which had been resulted in a really useful ruling from the Divisional Court in respect of the full the Divisional Court, I should say, clarified that the full climate arguments could be made when you come to the actual development consent stage. So we didn't then take that ground forward because we've got a really useful clarification on that point.
Okay, cool. We've got a question from one of Friends of the Earth's local groups, actually, Harwich Friends of the Earth. Have there been any similar challenges to airport expansion elsewhere in the world that you guys know of?
I'm not sure about in the world. Not enough time in the day for me to know all of the things, but certainly aviation's taking a bit of a knock in the UK, and there have been other successful pushbacks. I believe Stansted is one of them. There's an interesting development decision waiting at Manson Airport currently, and so there are quite a few regional airports, and then we've heard a question about Manchester as well, where people are looking at this and pushing back. They're not all the same processes. I believe Bristol Airport, for example, also had a win in the planning process there. But so they're all slightly different. But certainly aviation is a big target for those of us who are trying to fight climate change.
And I think they've just done a call out for more questions because we've got about 5 minutes left. But in the meantime, I wanted to ask a little bit about how you came to be involved in the case, because from my understanding, it was local groups that were campaigning against Heathrow expansion, and then we got involved. So can one of you talk to that a little bit, and who approached who, and yeah, how it all got off the ground?
Katie, do you want to answer that, or shall I?
I'll have a go. I mean, I think to be fair, I joined slightly after some of the great thinking and digging for this case had begun. But as far as I understand, it was a case of looking at this draft AMPS during the consultation period and seeing that there was absolutely no mention of the Paris Agreement, which was just astonishing given the huge carbon implications of the project and the constant talk from government about its commitment to Paris and how it was determined to be a leader in the environmental field and lead other countries on this issue. So it just seemed to be a complete disconnect between the rhetoric and the reality of action. So on that basis, we Friends of the Earth got talking with our local groups and came up with this decision when the AMPS was adopted to try and fight this on climate grounds. Is that about right, Will?
I think that's good. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. I put you on the spot there a bit. This is the last question from Ian, and he asks, how vulnerable are these cases with Brexit and with a lack of European jurisdiction?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, so with this case, most of it's based on domestic legislation. By that I mean, legislation, statute that's been made domestically and hasn't come from Europe, although environmental assessment, which was relying on a EU directive. And for so long as we stay within the EU, EU law is supreme. That was one of the main reasons some people wanted to get out of the EU, is so we kind of reclaim what they called sovereignty more directly than pooling it with the rest of Europe. So in the future, when we're not part of the EU, you can't point to a directive and go, you have to comply with that. And so there will be a gradual departing of, divergence, if you like, of UK law and EU law. So some elements will be weakened. I hope that's clear.
I can add to that a little bit as well. Just to be clear that the directive has been implemented international law via regulation, so they are a part of national law now, and also, as Will said, the Planning Act was enacted nationally, so it's not connected with the EU, and also very interestingly, the precautionary principle, which was endorsed specifically by the Court of Appeal in relation to these non-CO2 impacts. The version of the principle they referred to was actually from the Rio Declaration, which has again nothing to do with the EU, and that's very interesting at a time when we're transitioning out of the European Union, because it's widely or has been considered to be an EU law principle, and this is the Court of Appeal saying no. It's much broader than that, and that's very helpful for us because it's national common law, and that we're not going to just lose it when we come out of the EU.
Okay, great, thank you both. We've got one final one to sneak in, one from Mike. What are the cost implications to Friends of the Earth having to deal with the appeal?
Well, in broad brush terms, it's going to cost us more money, unfortunately. I mean, the cost consequences depend on whether you win or lose, ultimately. So costs, so if you lose, you have to pay the other side's cost to a certain extent. As the type of claimant we are as an environmental claimant and an environmental organisation, non-profit organisation as well, we get cost protection. We're currently figuring out how much that would be, but the £10,000 cap, that's what the default cap would be in proceedings, but it can vary, and we have to pay our own lawyers a little bit, and so that all adds up. So it costs money, and it's worth it. You've got to go for these things. You can't back out.
I could add to that a little bit as well. Just in terms of the cost protection, we don't yet know what that's going to be, as Will has said. We did have to defend our default cost cap in the Court of Appeal. The government tried to raise it to £35,000, so considerably more than £10,000. We don't know yet whether the developers are going to try to increase our cost cap as well here, so we'll have to wait and see on that. And generally there are other fees as well associated with court, like disbursements, court fees, etc. So it's a piece of litigation is always very expensive. As there's a huge amount of hours that go into the preparation of it, and then the actual advocacy in court as well. So it's a substantial sum, sort of tens of thousands we're looking at.
Well, and also to add to that, I think the government, it cost them much more than that. I remember in the High Court, they turned up with a cost schedule that was 6 figures already, and it was an early stage in the High Court proceedings. So I wouldn't be surprised if this has cost them, more than £1 million. And although they won't be in the Supreme Court stage, obviously. So yeah, just to reinforce, these things are expensive, but we have a in-house legal team, so we're able to internalise some of those costs. But yeah.
We're very grateful for you guys. Right, okay. I'm going to wrap up there. Thank you so much, Will and Katie. For the live audience, as Will said, this will be going to the Supreme Court. We have launched a fundraising appeal to help with that work. And thank you to those who've already donated. For those who haven't and still wish to, I think the moderators have posted a URL in the chat. And there's a link that you can follow below the video on YouTube. And a final thing is that, we spoke a little bit about local groups who are campaigning against Heathrow, and they've really been instrumental in sort of bringing this case towards the media as well, and really showing the human aspect. And we've got quite a few of these groups who are working within their communities to help fight climate breakdown. So if you'd like to get involved in a group near you, then head to takeclimateaction.uk. If you have any further questions, or you feel like your question wasn't answered, then you can always contact our supporter care team on info@fo.co.uk. But that's it from us. Will and Katie, I just wanted to say thanks and congrats on your great work. And to the audience for listening, thank you very much. And we hope to see you at our next live talk. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye, everyone.